Well, I hope you're all having a good day. In this session, I want to talk briefly about some common misunderstandings about motivating others. And I also want to talk just for a few minutes about intrinsic motivation. All the PowerPoint slides that I'll be showing are available on the course website under this module. When we talk about motivation, what most people who haven't studied it much tend to know about is what people refer to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you've probably seen something like this, perhaps in an introductory psychology course or in an introductory organizational behavior course. This is fine. Not being critical of Maslow here, but the research in work settings is not especially supportive of the way people have widely interpreted Maslow's model. For example, it's hard to demonstrate empirically that there are 5 different needs, as Maslow would suggest. It's also hard to demonstrate that those needs are organized in a particular hierarchy, or that only one need tends to dominate others at any one time. And the whole concept of needs is a bit fuzzy. So in the end, although a very nice way of thinking about humans and our broader aspirations, it's not especially helpful in the context of work motivation. So what I'd like to do is talk a bit about some concepts that are more focused on motivation at work. Now, as I said, this set of PowerPoint slides is available on the course website, so I'm not going to show all the slides, but I am going to talk about a few, and as I talk about them, I want to try to emphasize where people tend to go wrong sometimes. Okay. None of the things I'm going to say tonight contradict what is in the textbook, but they are a slightly different perspective and angle than what you find in the textbook. So I'm going to start with goals, and again, I'll skip over some things, but I want to kind of get here in this slide to the core principles of goal setting. And so I'm going to come back to this slide, but before I go too far with it, almost everybody has seen this particular acronym called the SMART acronym, saying that goals ought to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and there should be a time frame. And I don't have any particular problems with this acronym, other than that it misses 2 important things that we know from the goal setting literature. And goal setting and its application in work settings is widely studied. There are well over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies in a variety of settings that have examined the impact of goal setting. And of course, it's true that goals should be specific. You don't get any place by telling people to do your best. So being specific is important. And I will turn to that some more, because what people mean by specific is often a bit misguided. But the 2 big things that I think that SMART acronym misses is, first of all, the importance of goal difficulty. Stated simply, more difficult goals lead to higher performance than easier goals. And if you have a choice between setting goals that are easy, maybe moderate in difficulty, very difficult, or impossible, you ought to pick the ones that are very difficult. It's no good setting impossible goals. People will simply reject a goal if they believe it to be impossible. It may or may not be impossible in your mind, but if they believe it to be impossible, they'll reject it and it won't motivate their performance at all. But very difficult goals lead to higher performance than do easier goals. The other thing is that a goal has to be accepted by the person who's going to be doing the work. And of course, in many instances in work settings, people simply accept a goal given to them by somebody in authority. But that's not always the case. They might say they accept it, but mentally they're not accepting it. And one of the best ways to get people to accept goals is to engage them in the goal setting process in some manner, because the research shows that that increases goal acceptance. So the things that are missing in that SMART acronym, again, are the importance of goal acceptance and the importance of goal difficulty. Now, with that said, again, I'm going to skip over some things. These are actual examples of goals I have seen people in organizations write where they thought these were good goals. They thought they were specific, but they're not. You know, being more open-minded about others' views is not a specific goal. Serving as a mentor or a role model is not a specific goal. Of course, inspiring trust, I think we can all understand, is not a specific goal. So let me pursue this and give you some examples. Imagine somebody says they want to be more open-minded about others' views and suggestions. Somebody I was coaching in an organization a number of years ago, done a lot of leadership coaching, had written this goal based on some feedback that he had received. And I understand the intent of the goal, but they weren't at all clear about what it would actually turn into. Ultimately, as I kind of pushed and we talked back and forth, they came up with, I think, a better and more specific way of getting at this idea of being more open-minded. And that was that they were going to ask others for their suggestions at each staff meeting. They were going to keep track of the number of suggestions that they adopted. And over time, they were going to try to adopt at least some reasonable number or some reasonable percentage of the suggestions that were offered to them. I don't like the idea of stating 20% as the rate at which they will adopt suggestions. Look at if 80% of the suggestions are good, adopt them. If 3% of the suggestions are good, adopt them. So I don't like a specific percentage, but I think what's written on the right is a lot better than what's written on the left. Here's another example. Again, somebody had said, I want to serve as a mentor or a role model to others. This also occurred in a leadership coaching setting. And again, after kind of some dialogue back and forth, the person later came back and said, okay, I get it. That's a little vague. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to meet monthly with one member of my team to discuss and offer guidance about career plans and development efforts. Yeah, that's a lot better. It's at least clear. You can track it. You can measure it. Makes a lot more sense. And here's one that might seem harder to do. Somebody said, I want to become a better listener. By the way, this is a very common thing that people say to me in the skill development contracts that they write in this course. Very common. I don't know what it means exactly. Kind of get it in the broad sense, but it's not a very specific goal. And as again, I talked with somebody else about this, they turned it into this thing on the right. So that is, before offering my opinion at a staff meeting, I'm going to make sure I try to ask at least one clarifying question so I know what's going on. I want to try to restate others' positions to give them a chance to say, no, that's not what I meant. And I want to ask them whether or not I've understood them correctly. And only then would I take the time to then offer my own opinion. And I think that's it's a much more easy goal to track. It's much more specific, and it clarifies what's meant by being a better listener, at least to this person. Okay? So that's kind of one thing. Again, goal setting, important, but don't forget the goal acceptance. Don't forget goal difficulty. And finally, what people think is a specific goal is often not even remotely specific. And you can make almost anything, even listening or mentoring, into a very specific goal. Okay, with that said, I'm going to move on to some other stuff here. And again, skip over some stuff. I want to talk about the concept of self-efficacy. This is an enormously important concept in motivating others, and one that's very commonly overlooked. So here's what self-efficacy is. Self-efficacy is the extent to which you think you can achieve a goal if you put in the effort. Now, I want to emphasize this. It's not the same thing as ability. You might have a fair amount of ability, but if you lack a sense of self-efficacy, then you're not likely to put in much effort. I'll give you a concrete example of this with me. I have always struggled with any attempt to learn a foreign language or even a little bit of a foreign language. I was traveling to Paris a few years ago, and I bought one of these courses that you can pick up in Barnes and Noble, where you can learn another language. And I really struggled with it. And as I continued to struggle with it over a few weeks, I just eventually gave up. This is very typical of people who have low self-efficacy. I don't have a sense that I'm good at learning other languages. I do have a sense that I'm good at learning quantitative things. So when it came time for me to learn a little bit about structural equation modeling, I kind of felt like, yeah, I bet you I can do this. I bought a book, read the book, not an incredibly complicated book, but read the book to get a general idea. I attended a half-day workshop on how to use a particular software package that does structural equation modeling. And it's complicated, very complicated stuff. But I've always been good at stat, and I've always been good at math. And I just thought, look, if I persist with this, I'm going to learn it. And sure enough, I did. So so I have high self-efficacy in that area. And I had it before I even started learning about structural equation modeling, because I've just always believed I can do stuff like this. So self-efficacy is enormously important. And a lot of times when we're looking at somebody who's not working well, or they don't appear to be motivated, it doesn't occur to us to ask ourselves whether or not this person has a reasonable level of self-efficacy that they can actually achieve this task. Because if they don't, they simply will not exert the effort, and they will give up quickly. They will give up quickly. Okay, so that's an important concept to keep in mind. And so let me talk a little bit about what you can do to actually enhance somebody's sense of self-efficacy. Okay, so sorry. Here's the bottom line. When you have self-efficacy about something, you set more challenging goals for yourself. You persist when you're faced with some setbacks. And if you get negative feedback, you tend to respond by exerting more effort. And people with low self-efficacy set easier goals. They do not tend to persevere. They tend to give up when they're faced with setbacks, and they lower their effort after they get negative feedback. So what do? Well, here's a few things you can do. The first is what's called a small win strategy. If you're a manager, or even trying to deal with yourself and your own sense of self-efficacy, it's really important to break apart a large task and give workers only one part at a time. Don't give them all of it. Give them one part at a time. It can be very overwhelming to somebody with low self-efficacy to deal with a large, complicated task. Break it apart. Give them one part at a time. Second, take this complicated task and let them kind of accomplish successively more difficult tasks. In teaching statistics, a lot of people say to me, I'm no good at statistics. And I've coached and taught statistics in my life a bunch. And I always say, I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a second. I believe that you might think you're not good at it, but I don't believe that you're not good at it. And what my focus is on taking something that might be very simple to me, but breaking it apart into even simpler steps so that the person can master a very simple thing, and then I give them something a little more difficult, and then a little more difficult, and a little more difficult. Let me give you a classic example. I was doing some coaching with a leader at GlaxoSmithKline probably 8 or 9 years ago. I was doing a bunch of work at GlaxoSmithKline for several years there. And this one leader had inherited a new group. It was a group of laboratory technicians and who literally did the lab work. If you walked in and you have an image in your mind of what a chemistry or biology lab might look like, that's what this looked like. And this team had been a team that was not highly regarded, And part of what people were looking for from the guy I was coaching, who was a director level guy, was to try to turn this team around. So I'm just going to focus on one example. He realized fairly quickly that one of the people in the team seemed to be kind of quiet, modest, unassuming, but seemed to have much more ability than the person gave herself credit for. He thought this person could progress and really move beyond this fairly narrow role that she was in. And so what he did is he started off, he would do a weekly meeting with his team. It was just like an hour long. But he started off by asking this person to help him with the weekly meetings. And he started off with something very simple, which was asking her to just kind of put together a couple of slides that kind of summarize some technical data, and because she knew so much about this. And he would help her kind of work out how to make the slides attractive and compelling. And after a while, she got really good at that. And then he kind of got to the point where he said, listen, I'm putting together this thing for next week. And you put together the slides, these 2 slides. I mean, there's lots of other stuff that we're going to talk about for the hour, but you put together these 2 slides. Why don't you present them? And she was, of course, a little hesitant, but he kind of encouraged her. And because she'd put together the slides, she could present them pretty effectively, and she did that, and he praised her. And, of course, he kept increasing that, kind of building that up over the course of a number of months. He also asked her to attend the monthly meetings that he had with his boss, who was a vice president. And he said, I'd just like you to be there to help me kind of take some notes and make sure I've got my ideas correct. And then he asked her to help him put together some slides for those meetings where he was going to be presenting the slides. And you can see where this is headed, of course. After a number of months, he had literally gotten her to the point where she would stand up and present several of the slides or a kind of a key idea or a key lab result to everybody at this vice president meeting. Going from this kind of meek, quiet person to somebody having the confidence to do that. That's a great example of providing people with an opportunity to accomplish successively more difficult tasks. Another thing you can do is you can model the desired behavior for the person. And that's one of the things that this guy did with this woman. He started off by modeling the desired behavior. As that got more complicated, he continued to model it. He pointed to others who were really good at doing these kinds of things, so she would have an opportunity to learn from them. He arranged for coaching from successful models. He was a successful model. And he expressed a lot of confidence in the person's ability. Putting all these things together, you can really build somebody's self-efficacy in an area where they lack it. And that will change their behavior and the effort they exert and their level of motivation and their success. Okay. I want to just talk about one other thing quickly, and that's reinforcement. Everybody thinks they know what reinforcement means, but they don't. So I'm not going to go through a lot of detail, but I do want to mention a couple things. So these are some obvious things. These come all the way back to the father of reinforcement. His name was B.F. Skinner. Behavior that's rewarded is more likely to reoccur. Behavior that is completely ignored by everybody is likely to disappear. And behavior that is punished might disappear, but only while the person is being monitored. I want to underline that, emphasize the last part of that sentence, but only while the person is being monitored. So managers who rely on punishment as a strategy create 2 problems for themselves. One is you might think that you're suppressing the behavior, but you're only suppressing it while you're monitoring or somebody else is monitoring for you the situation. That's a really bad way to have a team operating. So, but behavior that you reward, that is much more advantageous because that behavior will occur even in your absence. Now, here's the thing. Let me give you a quick example. I was doing some consulting for a bank. This is a long time ago. I remember this example vividly. It was about 15 years ago. And it was an interesting scenario. There was a woman who was a branch manager, and the branch manager had this habit, a very nice habit, I applaud this habit, of stopping and on I think it was Friday mornings, and kind of picking up at a Dunkin' Donuts a bunch of donuts and one of those big boxes of coffee they have and stuff, and bring it in and just give it to everybody is kind of a way of saying thanks for what you did this week. And that's a very nice thing to do. I applaud it. It's not reinforcement. It's not reinforcement. Reinforcement has to be contingent on a specific behavior. That means if the behavior doesn't occur, there's no reinforcement. And the person has to know what behavior is being reinforced. So bringing in coffee and donuts and thanking everybody is a really nice thing to do as a boss. Love it, but it's not going to change behavior. So reinforcement is always this idea that I'm reinforcing a specific behavior. And if that specific behavior doesn't occur, then the reinforcement doesn't occur. It's also important to never presume that you know what somebody else finds to be rewarding. Again, I worked with a woman, even before I was at LaSalle. I was a person who managed people, if that makes any sense, in a very large corporation. And kind of what they called a third level manager there. Fifth level was executive, so I wasn't at that level. But, it's kind of managing people and who managed folks. And here's the thing. One of the people who worked for me, who was terrific, had been. Yeah, if everybody can mute themselves, that'd be great. Okay. Thanks. So one of the people who was there had been offered promotions on 2 occasions, something based on accomplishments this woman had had at work, and she was really terrific. And interestingly, she turned down both promotions. And this is a promotion that she was being offered a 3rd level, which was my level. And it's an extremely hard level to reach. The 1st and 2nd levels are much easier to do. The 3rd level is very hard. Only about 5% or 7% of people ever reached it. Yet she was offered it twice and turned it down. And everybody thought, well, isn't that a great reward? But she didn't see it as a great reward. She saw it as, this is going to be more work. I'm going to get paid more money, but I'm going to be here more hours. My husband and I already make plenty of money. Why on earth would I want to get more stress, more responsibility, work more hours for something that's really not going to change my life in any meaningful way, and in fact is likely to probably lessen the quality of my life? So something that everybody else found rewarding, she didn't find rewarding. So the really important thing in reinforcing an employee's behavior for a specific kind of behavior that you want to shape is to make sure that you understand what the heck that person finds rewarding. And I have literally seen people, this is not me, but I have seen people where the most rewarding thing that they could imagine would be to get a parking space closer to the building. You never know. Okay, one other point about reinforcement. Unlike rats and dogs, people learn through what we call social learning or observational learning. That is to say, people will change their behavior if they see somebody else getting rewarded for a desired behavior. They will begin to demonstrate that same desired behavior. So we're not, God, I love dogs, but it's not the same thing as dogs and rats and laboratories and stuff. We will learn by watching somebody else get reinforced. And we will learn if somebody else's good behavior is completely ignored, we will learn not to engage in that behavior. Why bother? It's never going to be reinforced. So it's really important as a manager to understand this social effective learning. It's not just what you're doing with one employee, it's what each employee is seeing you do with others. And those are very powerful effects in reinforcement. Okay, I've already talked about some of the problems with punishment, but here's just a quick summary of them. Most of us allow some people more leeway than we do others for the exact same problem. We're often very uncomfortable providing punishment or giving negative feedback or taking disciplinary action. And so we delay doing it. And I've been guilty of this. Believe me, I have been guilty of this. So one of the rookie mistakes I made in my late 20s, which was decades ago, when I was first managing, I had about 10 people working for me. And when I was first managing a bunch of people, I was uncomfortable taking action. I kept putting it off and putting it off. And then when I finally did react to the situation, I really overreacted to the situation. Also, if you've ever worked for a boss who's constantly nagging people and constantly criticizing people, everybody just gets used to it. I worked for somebody like that about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and not in my department, but at LaSalle. And this person's style was to be critical, hardly ever positive or reinforcing. And people just, initially were annoyed and frustrated and angry, and after a while, they just kind of laughed and ignored the person. Finally, punishment requires that you can closely monitor somebody's behavior. And that's not what you want to be doing. You want to be doing other stuff. Uh-huh. Punishment also leads the person to avoid being around you, which is a smart strategy, but you don't want that either. And there's a considerable body of research in the last 10 or 15 years published in the best journals in my field that have demonstrated that punishment leads to sabotage and retaliation in the workplace. People might sabotage equipment, they might, but they're going to retaliate some way. Okay, so that's a little bit about that. And again, I'm going to skip on to one of our other topics here. And so they've got two left. And this next one I want to talk about briefly is called equity. So here's what equity means. So if you're in finance, obviously you think about equities, but has a completely different meaning in management. So let's talk about that. I ask each one of you to think about this right now. How would you determine whether or not you're being paid fairly? How would you determine whether or not you're being paid fairly? What kinds of information would go into that judgment? Well, it turns out that there are at least 4 pieces of data that are important for making that judgment, and that most people use when they're making that judgment. You might not consciously think about it, but I'll bet you use them. The first is that you're thinking about the outcomes you're getting from your work. That could be pay or benefits or recognition or job security or job satisfaction or the flexibility to work at home sometimes or whatever it might be. Those are all outcomes. You're also, of course, thinking about your inputs. What's your level of education? How much expertise do you have in this job? What's your level of ability here? How much effort do you put into this? How much experience have you had? How many years have you been working in this field? Those are inputs. And if you think about your outcomes and your inputs, it turns out that is insufficient to determine in your mind whether or not you're being paid fairly. All the research suggests you need to know 2 other things. You are thinking about at some level, what are other people's inputs? What are they bringing to the table? What's their level of education? How much effort do they have? What's their skill set? How many years of experience do they have? And what are their outcomes? What are they getting paid? What are their benefits? What are they getting out of this job? And what we do is kind of mentally and informally, not in any formal mathematical sense, we think about what's the ratio of my outcomes to my inputs. So if I think about, here are the outcomes I'm getting, and here are the inputs I'm getting, then I'm going to compare myself to somebody else I know. What are their outcomes? What are their inputs? And by the way, those people might or might not work in the same job you do, and they might or might not work in the same company that you do. And what equity theory and research has demonstrated is that people want their ratio to be the same as the ratio of other people. As a simple example, I'm okay with the fact that somebody who's the president of LaSalle University gets paid probably, I don't actually know her pay, although it's public, but might get paid 5 times what I get paid or 4 times what I get paid. That doesn't bother me because her inputs are a lot larger than mine. So in the end, our ratios are probably the same. She's dealing with much bigger problems. She has much more leadership experience in that kind of a role I would never want to have. And I expect her outcomes to be bigger. That's fine. I also don't mind that I make more than our department admin. A really nice person. But the bottom line, who, and I'm not being critical of her in any way. I actually love her. She's been with us 20 years. She's just a wonderful, sweetheart, delightful, and helpful person. But the bottom line, she doesn't have a high school degree, and she can't do a lot of the things that the faculty do. So the faculty, of course, are paid much more than she's getting paid. I don't know what that is. I don't know her exact salary, but on average, I would bet you faculty are being paid about 5 times what she's being paid. That makes sense. Our outcomes are bigger because our inputs are bigger. So what happens when an employee doesn't think these ratios are equal? Okay, what happens? If I think that my ratio of outcomes to inputs is less favorable than somebody else's, I'm going to try to correct that situation. Now, one way to do that, of course, is to simply reduce my effort, because that's one of my inputs. It's a very common thing that employees do. Well, the hell with it. Why should I work so hard when I'm getting this and somebody else is getting so much more? I'm not going to work as hard as they do. To hell with it. Or they quit and they leave. Or they do something else. They might try to make a case to get them their compensation increased. I actually did that about 15 years ago at LaSalle, and the dean bought my argument, and I got my compensation increased. Worked out really well. But I realized that's unrealistic for a lot of people. But the bottom line is somebody's going to do something. You are not going to tolerate this inequity for long. And people who are working for you won't tolerate that inequity for long. So this sense of equity is a really important thing that will depress motivation. Equity is not so much something that motivates people, but the absence of equity really demotivates people. And so when you're working with managing somebody who doesn't seem to be exerting a lot of effort, there are a lot of questions you can ask. We've talked about several today, from goals to reinforcement to self-efficacy. But another one is, does this person perceive that their situation is equitable? It's not a matter of whether it is, it's a matter of whether or not they perceive it. So sometimes it's really helpful to explain to people that their outcomes are indeed comparable to the outcomes of others. And a number of companies, in order to do this, actually will publish comparable data. I know one company, it's a kind of a, it was a startup a bunch of years ago, but now it's a well-known company on the web that people can access all kinds of music on. I won't go into the details. I was talking from somebody there, and he said, you know, we're allowed to go to HR anytime we want, and they will show us databases with salaries of people in our positions in other companies, so we can see what we're being paid. And their deal is that if our salary is not comparable to the average firm that is like our firm, to do my job, they will on the spot increase my salary. It's a pretty neat concept. I want to close with this. I want to close with the concept of intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation refers to the idea that I am motivated not because of what somebody else does, but because I just enjoy doing this task myself. I enjoy this activity. And you know, there are probably many things that you find intrinsically motivating in your life, but your job may or may not be one of them. But one of the most important things in hiring is to try to find people who are intrinsically motivated, energized by the kind of work they're being asked to do. And when people are intrinsically motivated, they're doing it because they enjoy the activity itself. They enjoy this kind of work. That's positively related to their performance. They work harder, they persist more, they're more creative, and they feel a bigger sense of well-being, psychological well-being. But extrinsic motivation is very different than intrinsic. In extrinsic motivation, you're taking an action to achieve an outcome. That's kind of what reinforcement's doing. You're taking this action to achieve an outcome, or to at least avoid some undesirable outcome. But intrinsic motivation is the most desirable situation you can possibly get with people on your team. And when you don't have it, it's very tough to overcome it. But I'm going to give you some ideas about how you might be able to. But the biggest thing in intrinsic motivation is to hunt for people in hiring who are very much engaged by the nature of the culture and the work that they would be given in your organization. Now, um, uh, based on thinking about intrinsic motivation, um, people who've done this describe three basic kind of psychological things that most of us want. We want to have the opportunity to have autonomy. That is to say, we want to have some opportunity to decide what our actions ought to be. We want to have latitude. Almost everybody wants reasonable levels of autonomy. Secondly, we want to feel some sense that we belong. We want to feel some sense that we're being supported by others, not just outside of work, but inside of work. This is very much related to some questions that I asked, by the way, as you will probably readily recall, in our most recent assignment on power. And finally, I want to feel competent. I want to feel like I'm good at this. I want to feel a sense of efficacy, a sense of mastery. And people want all three of those. And people who experience all three of those, they're generally intrinsically motivated. You know, I like what I'm doing now. I feel kind of competent. I feel like I'm mastering this. I feel like I belong here. I feel like I'm being supported by others. And I feel like I have some autonomy and some latitude to approach this the way I want to. Not complete autonomy, but some reasonable level of autonomy. Those three things often add up to intrinsic motivation, right? So when we have these kinds of work environments, right, people believe that their organization is supporting them. They believe that their situation is just and equitable. They have a sense of positive psychological well-being. They are more satisfied with their work. They're more engaged in their work. They have experienced positive emotions much more than other people do. Their work performance is better, and they engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, which is a way of saying they help others. Remember the Adam Grant stuff that was in the last assignment, okay? When they don't experience this, oddly enough, they experience, of course, more negative emotion. That's not surprising. But it's also related to work-family conflict. People go home depressed, upset, annoyed, and frustrated. And that has an effect on their family. It has an effect on their friends. So some work environments create these positive environments and some block them. What can you do as the manager? Okay. Well, you can try to enable employees to control how they complete tasks. That is to say, don't focus so much on the means, focus on the end. Give people some latitude about the means. The end, the end goal of what the organization needs to accomplish, that might be less flexible. But how to approach it, to the extent possible, you want to give people some latitude about that. Of course, the worst thing you could do is to micromanage, because then somebody has no latitude, and you've really killed intrinsic motivation. Second thing you can do is create opportunities where employees can use skills and develop skills. Provide feedback that people find helpful. That is, you're providing feedback that helps people develop skills. It's not intending to be negative. It's helping them develop skills. And as you give them the feedback, they have enough trust and belief in you that they actually think that's why you're doing it. You're doing this to be helpful to me. And you help them reflect and learn from their experiences. And of course, this helps people develop a sense of efficacy and competence. And again, final thing, create an environment where people are supportive of each other. Do you have an environment where, as I think Adam Grant from the University of Pennsylvania, from the Wharton School, in our last assignment, would say that people are givers, and people are helpful to each other. And it's an environment where people feel free to ask for help. And an environment where you reward collaboration among employees rather than competition. Very frequently in the last assignment, and this happened in a few of them that I've been grading today, they describe some departments, the person writing the assignment describes some departments where people are incredibly competitive. And they'll do almost anything, not only to get ahead, but to step on others in order to get ahead. That's really a bleak environment to work in, and it destroys intrinsic motivation. And the bottom line is, do you express genuine concern and empathy for your employees' situations? Like, people really want to know if they're doing something hard or difficult, or they're going through difficult times, that you understand, that you have empathy for that. You are concerned about that, that your concern for them goes beyond just being a worker, but you're concerned about them as a person. And those things create this sense of relatedness. And all these things together create this sense of intrinsic motivation. And if people are intrinsically motivated, almost everything else falls into place. Okay? So that's those are the main points I wanted to get to today. And I hope this has been at least somewhat helpful for you. And I'm going to launch a very short poll here, which I'll just ask you to respond to. Remember that when you're responding to this poll, which you should now be able to see, I don't know what you're saying. I only know the aggregate data. So if you could just take a second and indicate your whether or not this session was helpful or interesting to you, that would be really good for me. Just give you a bit more time to do that, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, well, that's very helpful. I appreciate your feedback. Sounds like the session was perceived as being interesting or helpful. That's always my goal. And again, I appreciate your letting me know your feedback. Again, I don't know who said what, but it is very helpful for me in terms of my own work and keeping me intrinsically motivated, I guess I would say. So that's the end of our session for today. And I want to thank you for being here. And the final thing I want to say